this young generation, because of all the reasons we've talked about and more, seems to exhibit the traits of being very conflict avoidant, very uncomfortable with uncomfortable. That has some impact that are sometimes funny, quote unquote, but always tend to make somebody feel more lonely. So for example, and I've seen this happen, I've heard about these stories so many times, a young employee who may feel they're in line for a raise, but is so uncomfortable to go to their boss and ask for a raise that they just quit, that they would rather quit than have an uncomfortable conversation. And then sometimes it is followed by an angry email that says, I'm undervalued, you don't appreciate me, you underpay me, you know? And I've heard it happen so many times where the leadership is like, what? We would have happily, like, I'm sorry, we were either planning on giving you a raise, we'd happy to give you a raise, you know? And it's really uncomfortable to walk in your boss's office and be like, hey, I'm working really hard, can I have a raise, please? Now, the time you do get to quit is when you've had this conversation 4, 5, 6 times and you've seen nothing and had no feedback and had no impact. Then absolutely you quit. And absolutely you say, you undervalue me, you underappreciate me, we've had this conversation 5 or 6 times. Then it's their fault because they had all the information. But again, it's really funny how many young kids they would rather quit than have a difficult conversation, or they'd rather break up than have a difficult conversation. Or worse, they'd rather ghost someone than break up with them. Because it's really uncomfortable to have a fight and a breakup and call each other names. It's much easier to just turn off all the social media, unfollow everywhere. I know we've been dating for 6 months, but I'm just gonna now ignore every text, ignore all your calls, and think about it we talk about service. Think about the service or disservice we do the other person. From their point of view, it's like you got in a car accident. It's like you were just killed. It's like you just disappeared off the planet. That is trauma. Because you're uncomfortable to have an uncomfortable conversation, you would do that to another person. So service goes both ways, which is I will make myself uncomfortable and have a difficult conversation, even if I bumble it and screw it up and it ends up being a screaming match. Because that is a better option than traumatizing a person where they have to believe that first of all, that I've died because they can't get hold of me, in the panic. And then when they realize I'm alive because they see me on Instagram, that now I've destroyed their self-confidence. How dare somebody do that to another human being? Because you're just a little uncomfortable of having an uncomfortable conversation. Where we can help is we can teach people how to have uncomfortable conversations. That is a skill set. We don't teach leaders how to have uncomfortable conversations. We don't teach students how to have uncomfortable conversations. We don't teach, we can teach these things all over the place. And I think it's a big gaping hole in curriculum. We teach, maths and we teach English, but we don't teach social interaction. We don't teach listening. We don't teach how to have uncomfortable conversations. We don't teach how to give and receive feedback. Now you tell me which is going to be more valuable for the rest of your life: how to have a difficult conversation or trigonometry.
Yeah.
And shouldn't we be, shouldn't we be preparing people for life?
Mm. On that point of that new generation in the workplace and how they're exhibiting traits of being a little bit more cowardly in terms of having those difficult conversations, you made a video about millennials in the workplace that did probably hundreds of millions of views.
Yeah.
I remember seeing it on Facebook maybe 5 years ago, and I think it had 50 million views on that one video, but across YouTube, it's got tens of millions of views on many, many different videos.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking now about that new generation that you've described, that younger generation, that Gen Z generation that are emerging into the post-COVID world. Mm-hmm. What is the workplace for them? How do I as a leader make sure that if I'm hiring Gen Z, and I've got a couple even in this room that work in my company, what have we got to know about them and do to make sure that they thrive, stay motivated, and achieve their goals?
This is my own bias. I don't like the conversation of strengths and weaknesses. It's the famous question, in an interview: what's your biggest weakness? Well, I'm a perfectionist, I don't like the conversations of strengths and weaknesses because strengths often have liability. I'm really confident. Okay, in the wrong context, you're arrogant, right? But weaknesses also have silver linings. So for me, I'm chronically disorganized. I'm terrible, right? Every system app works for like a week and then I'm back to being disorganized. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? Now, for years, I used to beat myself up for it and say it's a bad thing. It's a terrible weakness. But the reality is it's context. So I was as a young entrepreneur, I was at this networking event and I met this guy who was like really impressed with what I had to say with my pitch. And he's like, Simon, we have to do work together. Here's my business card. Call me. Let's do this. And I lost the business card basically as soon as he gave it to me. So anybody who was organized would be sending a text from the taxi or at least sending an email the next day. Not Yahoo over here. I lost the business card. There was no way for me to find out what this important piece of business would have led to because I lost the card. 2 weeks later, I found the business card at the bottom of a briefcase. So I emailed him and said, hey, do you remember we met 2 weeks ago? I'd love to reconnect and see if we can work together still. He wanted to work with me more because he thought I was busy. So strength or weakness? The answer is it depends. Now, in general, yes, it is a weakness, it's a liability, and it causes me great stress. But not always is the point. And so, yes, it's important for us to understand our characteristics that we exhibit, of which some of them in certain contexts are huge strengths, and some of the exact same characteristics in the wrong context are huge weaknesses, right? So we have to be very careful when we label people or generations as being strong or weak, because the answer is it depends. Okay, so that's the preface. So when we talk about this young generation, the Gen Z generation, they exhibit many of the same characteristics as the previous generation, but they're quite different in the sense that they're very activist, right? So, for example, in the 1950s and 60s, people hated their jobs back then too. They just went to work every day and just suffered in silence. By the time you get to the 80s and 90s, people hated their jobs, but then they'd at least start talking about it around the office saying, this job kind of sucks a little bit, And then by the time you get sort of the 2000s, people start speaking up to their bosses saying, I think we should make it better to work here, And now you're in this young generation and they're just like, standing up and quitting and I love it, right? And they organize, they're much more, the previous generation would hashtag tweet my discontent as I'm sitting in my Uber on my way to brunch, but this young generation gets out and organizes and comes together. Plus or minus, it depends. Sometimes it's a huge strength, the fact that they have that kind of energy. But sometimes, as we've talked about as well, they also have the energy to quit instead of having an uncomfortable conversation. So strength or weakness, it depends. And so I think the way we have to approach all of these things is with empathy, which is instead of deciding if it's a strength or weakness, to try and understand where it comes from. Because I can say this generation is irresponsible and will quit before they ask for a raise, or I can say, why is it that they're quitting before they when they just need a raise? What happened between A and B in that thought, in those two actions? And I'm like, oh, they just missed the skill set. Oh, we can totally figure that one out. That one's an easy fix. So I'm not labeling a whole person or a whole generation. I'm rather recognizing that there's gaps of skills, which we all have. So when you ask me about any of the generations, and they all have strengths and they all have liabilities. And depending on the time frame and the context, sometimes those strengths also become old-fashioned, no longer necessary. They can still cause frustration. They can still cause confusion. We're still looking through them through our own prisms of our own generation. I've definitely caught myself doing it. I do it. My goodness, we never did that when we were kids. When I was their age, I'm actually saying that now. But I think the trial, the test is the practice of empathy, which is another skill that we can teach that's missing.
If you love the Diary of a CEO brand and you watch this channel, please do me a huge favor. Become part of the 15% of the viewers on this channel that have hit the subscribe button. It helps us tremendously, and the bigger the channel gets, the bigger the guests.